What I wanted to share with you is kind of the results of blue sky process, which normally follows an exercise like this. In this case, we had the unique joint privilege of just really kind of getting a brain dump download from some of the seeds that have been kind of incubating and nurturing over a lot of years. And in a lot of ways, it reminded me of what at Disney Imagineering we consider the very first blue sky exercise, which was Walt Disney kidnapping an art director basically and locking him into a soundstage and just doing a 20-year brain dump of the stuff that had been kind of on his heart for a lot of years. This was just a quick napkin sketch from one of our first meetings that ended up kind of influencing. So well, what if we did this kind of marriage, again, of not just of architecture and landscape, marrying the concept of structure with landform. And this idea of kind of basically a Teletubby building, the Hobbit, Shire, the Teletubby building. But no, like the idea of using very cost-effective, simple. We're really trying to do anti-architecture here, basically. What if this wasn't about architecture? What if it was about actually, in fact, using very cost-effective prefab, even shipping container, whatever. But basically, just stacking those, in a landform where we would use the land for retention, but we would also gain a lot of side benefits with that insulation, what have you. Stack that in a way that it kind of does create this kind of unique landform, but then at the center have kind of a heart of the community, have a gathering place that has that wonderful sense of spatial enclosure that all great gathering places, piazzas, third places around the world has, and unfortunately so often in suburban America we're missing, when you're eating at the Starbucks in front of a big parking lot and you're just kind of exposed to nature, traffic, whatever. It doesn't psychologically feel like a wonderful outdoor room with that sense of enclosure. We just thought, man, that would be really cool to have this wonderful urban grotto that felt like the center of this volcano caldera, kind of space. And so this was putting the plan into scale. And again, I could go on and on about urban planning history and what have you, but for the purposes of this thought exercise, we actually decided to place the project in North America. Shocking. And in North America, we have this history of kind of the way that the land was surveyed following the Jeffersonian grid and the purchase of, the Louisiana Purchase. And, America's kind of on this survey grid of a square mile grid. There's kind of these 36 square mile, 6x6 grid townships. This phrase, 40 acres and a mule. The reason that Walt Disney bought 160 acres in Anaheim was because that was the typical quarter section of land, that quarter mile. And so again, we actually based it on this cellular scale. We asked ourselves, what would be the minimum critical mass? Not just for a standalone prototype, utopia, whatever you want to call it, but what would be the seed that could turn into a tree, that could turn into a forest? What could be this minimum critical mass that could be not only an experiment for an individual neighborhood, but something that could be a viable model that could be replicated into, in fact, an entire urban, city and potentially an urban world that could be a more sustainable path forward. So with that, we actually kind of really looked at what would be the appropriate scale. And so, we didn't look at even a square mile, 600. We actually brought it all the way down to the old 40 acre and a mule scale of, what would a minimum critical mass neighborhood look like at 40 acres that certainly could be scaled up to include 4 of those nodes, 4 of those neighborhoods into a very walkable 5-minute walk radius, quarter section of land that would be about the size of any medieval walled town. Think of Siena or Tuscan Hill town. 5-minute walk to the center of the town well. But we wanted to start off with that great human scale. So that's basically what you see represented here is roughly a quarter mile section. Just a couple of behind the scenes, under the hood kind of operating paradigms. One is that economically we were kind of had one foot rooted in the world that I live in, which is working for for-profit clients that have IRRs and ROIs and residual land values in an urban context. And so basically the idea that this had to be economically not just sustainable, but actually had to have a business model. And so just some fundamental things that can be easily thrown out was, one, that there's an economic engine here, which is actually twofold. One is that it would be something worth seeing, that this would be a critical mass visitor attraction that could be located in a major U.S. urban area. It could be located in a tourist area, so places like Orange County or Orlando or Dubai, for example. The second, so there's a major visitor component. There's a potential revenue source here of hotel, conferencing, so on and so forth. The second component is a model that we thought wasn't too far-fetched, wasn't too kind of out there. I mean, there's been tons of Quaker and Mormon and religious colonies and utopias in history, but something that we didn't think was too crazy was the idea of a lifelong learning village, essentially kind of a college town, that classic town and gown kind of model, whether it's somewhere that we like to emulate, like in Oxford, Cambridge, or somewhere that we can stick our nose up, like where I live in Irvine, Orange County. but that idea of a college town kind of model but not just oriented around college, but in fact, again, lifelong learning that would really be something that really kind of self-defines like who would actually have the opportunity to participate in this. And it would also probably shorten the duration. I mean, these wouldn't necessarily be all lifelong residents. You would have probably a solid majority of folks that are here for a certain duration, whether it's based on their education, whatever their specific aspect of development, or they're part of the building, the nurturing, the ongoing maintenance, or for example, on faculty or staff. So those are just some kind of high-level stuff that I won't get into. But essentially, what we have is 100% intersection. Essentially, what we've done is nothing too crazy. Essentially, the parking is at grade level. We've got a couple of access points in the grid that basically takes you to so we're not doing this massive parking structure. We just have a parking. What we've done is structured the development. So many of you live in areas where you see this podium apartments going up. You have the same 4 or 5 story stick-built apartments going above ground level or podium parking. So it's essentially that type of construction, nothing too radical. But what we have at the 100% intersection is kind of a visitor entry complex that would be kind of the focal point, first impression, primarily for visitors. But essentially we have kind of the radius is defined by that core 5-minute walk to the center. This is that central kind of piazza, town square caldera that we're kind of calling community core. And then along the edges, we have some of the different uses. So for example, the hotel conference center over here, this idea of a park combined with a life forest, which is an alternative to a typical cemetery or a graveyard. Farmers market, some different focal points at those commercial corners that actually could be viable for adjacent neighbors. So at some level, this works as an urban infill project. It also works as a standalone project that could be sitting out in the Nevada desert. This is kind of just an aerial. And again, to be clear, that there's no architecture here. This is quick, vision casting, 3D modeling. But the idea of this elevated pathway here largely carries an elevated track for the personal rapid transit system, which is half a ride. It's an attraction. It's part of the appeal, similar to a Universal Studios tram tour or the old Disney People Mover. It's a visitor attraction that anyone would come through without getting in the way of residents or students. But it's kind of an elevated guided path that is not fixed rail, but it basically is part of the attraction component. But then separate from that, there's also a system for residents to be able to use that. Here you see the stacking of the containers and simply just using the roof of the neighbor in front of you as your front yard, so everyone gets that equal green space. The main street kind of curves through the slot canyon, inspired by the slot canyons at Zion, and then you emerge into this wonderful sense of openness with the exterior canyon. And then the centerpiece of the whole thing is this kind of metaphoric tree of life, kind of, again, a visual icon center tower. So this is looking quickly from the 100% intersection, that entry pavilion, the PRT tracks, kind of looking towards that. Instead of a direct axial main street, it's a little bit of a sinuous curve that creates a little bit of that sense of discovery that you would find, again, walking through a slot canyon or a medieval streetscape. And again, the scale, we really tried to just make this a human scale, like an Italian hill town. Nothing overly urban, like a Manhattan or anything. This is the scale of, again, that people did life before elevators, in terms of that 3, 4, 5 story scale, which is also, by the way, cost-effective from a construction perspective. This is essentially the primary transportation technology. So again, the idea of self-driving cars or privately owned vehicles being able to be parked at ground level, but largely underneath the core of the community. But then visitors and residents having access to the trackless automated people movers. This is the tracks of the elevated people mover, giving kind of the guided tour, emerging both along the outside perimeter to really be exposed to the central piazza, agora, but then also getting a look underground at some of the interior infrastructure, vertical farming systems, as well as letting people get around. And then the largely multi-use streets that are for the neighborhood electric vehicles, as well as pedestrians based on the Scandinavian concept of the Woonurfs, where kids can play, but you've also got local access to bring your groceries, to your front door and so on and so forth. And then pedestrian-only paths, including this kind of fun cantilevered bridge that would cut across kind of an upper level at that kind of central hub. So this is kind of just more of the vehicular stuff that I talked about, the parking access into the underground garage and the central vehicular drive. By the way, we abstractly modeled it based on U.S. Census data of the different household types, the different ages, so it kind of represents a kind of a petri dish sampling of that U.S. Demographic based on the census. In terms of the units, we've got everything from 400 square foot urban lofts, largely overlooking the central piazza, kind of wanting to be above the nightclub and the restaurants and the bar scene, all the way to 2,400 square foot, 4-bedroom, mid-century modern, kind of detached house. So one of the ideas was just having diversity, so a diversity of choices. So you're not forcing everyone into living this, higher density kind of urban loft lifestyle. If someone wants to have a 1,600 square foot townhome, I mean, it's all based on a very simple 20-foot grid, again, really everything from the detached homes to the studios can be done in these pretty cost-effective modular construction types. So again, a couple different examples of that, from the smaller units to kind of more the larger urban units. Again, modular structure for one of the larger 4-bedroom, 2,400 square foot homes. The concept of, again, Main Street kind of taking on that organic form that is modeled in scale after kind of a Tuscan hill town, but may have a little bit more of a environmentally, I mean, that whole environmental sustainability, hard on your sleeve, kind of is definitely there and apparent on this blending of kind of garden and architecture through the space and having that intersection. So I think that's kind of this is, by the way, the hotel, the Blue Planet Water Park. This is, again, looking down the Main Street, again, the visual icon of a Tree of Life, again, attraction, restaurant, visitor center component to the middle, and then down at the bottom you would have the mixed-use retail Main Street and restaurants, cafes surrounding the circular piazza. So very much a focus on an active, Main Street, town square. That really is the focus of the retail cafe. This is the kind of a few images for that center town square concept. So again, the idea of this kind of oasis grotto in the heart that really, again, is very lush, verdant, green, but also quite urban in terms of that vertical mixed use, having that active edge retail. This is actually an image of a shopping mall that was based on a volcano far in the horizon line in the distance. It was done in Italy, kind of a similar concept in some level. And so again, in this CommuniCore, things like the Lifelong Learning Institute, kind of this experimental education district, the conference center, the Agora, retail dining entertainment, an interfaith pavilion, and an amphitheater that would be kind of part of that blending. And the Tree of Life would be this kind of iconic attraction, again, visitor center, restaurant lounge, observation deck, a couple of different ways of doing that, but the idea of having a recognizable landmark that represents kind of we thought that Tree of Life metaphor was one that's pretty universal and non-controversial. This is actually a church that we designed, and again, the idea of playing up the use of natural light, the alabaster kind of golden hued light coming through the lobby, essentially, and then being able to enter into a multi-faith pavilion / theater that is a little bit more of a production-controlled black box type space that could certainly be used for all kinds of community events. Again, some of the perimeter uses we talked about was the hotel, water park, and the Blue Planet. This is some of the environmental infrastructure with the solar panels, the farms, interior container farms, the living machine for processing of the water. Some quick design imagery for that, the Life Forest Park, the Big Blue Planet Aquatic Center. It says, I mean, this functions as essentially like a Great Wolf Lodge conference, indoor water park. Any of the Gaylord properties are doing the same kind of thing. So that's all I drew up. So anyways, just wanted to share some of the brain damage that had been occurred before you guys got in the room. So we can't wait to build on a little nugget.